Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Withrow, and I'm the head of exhibitions and publications at the McMichael. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a really special program to introduce our landmark exhibition, Generations, the Sobey Family and Canadian Art, which opened last week at the McMichael. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the original lands of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe people. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which historically provided an integral connection for Indigenous people between Ontario's lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay region. As an institution, the McMichael recognizes the importance of acknowledging the original territories of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe First Nations people and other Indigenous nations. So if you haven't already booked a ticket to see Generations, I know you will want to by the time we're through tonight. So run, don't walk to our website. Tickets can be booked there. We're booking time tickets right now to ensure that the space is never crowded, but walk-ups can almost always be accommodated as well. Visiting us is a wonderful way to support us. We love to deliver virtual programs like this one free of charge that reach audiences across Canada, but we can only do this with the support of viewers like you. So support us by visiting us, by buying our books, by becoming a member of the McMichael. Members get all kinds of special perks, including advance notice of our goings on and discounts in the shop, or by making a donation. You can see on the slide, we've made it very easy to support us in big ways or small ways with just a few clicks or taps of your screen. Speaking of generous support, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the very generous supporters of this exhibition, and in particular, who are on the slide here, and in particular, single out Scotiabank, whose visionary support allowed this show and the accompanying publication to rise to our highest ambitions for both. The result is really truly glorious and will be reaching audiences across our country throughout the next 2 years. The presentation at the McMichael is the first. The show will travel on to the Rooms in Newfoundland, continues to the Art Gallery of Alberta in Edmonton, the Confederation Arts Centre in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, and the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia in Halifax. So we're just so grateful to our supporters for making this very ambitious project possible. One more thing I'll say before I introduce our panelists tonight. If you have questions during the talk, please put them in the Q&A. It's the button at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer them as we go, and we have a little bit of time, I hope, that will be reserved at the end where we can answer some of the questions. And with that, I'll just introduce our dynamic duo, our panelists for tonight, Sarah Milroy and Ian Dejardin, two of the foremost experts of the art of this country. Sarah Milroy is our chief curator and one of our country's most respected public voices on the art of Canada. She joined the McMichael in 2018 after serving as national art critic for the Globe and Mail and publisher of Canadian Art, a decade each, and since then has curated no less than 12 major exhibitions for the McMichael, notably recently Uninvited, Canadian Women Artists in the Modern Moment, and Early Days, Indigenous Art at the McMichael. Ian Dejardin is our executive director and another of Canada's most respected voices on the art of this country. He joined the McMichael in 2017 after 12 years as the director of the Dulwich Picture Gallery, from which post he curated Painting Canada, which was a monumental exhibition of the group of 7 that toured Europe to great fanfare before returning to Canada to great fanfare. And it was presented at the McMichael for 9 wonderful weeks in 2012. He has become one of the nation's foremost experts on Canadian art, with a particular focus on the group of 7 and its contemporaries. Sarah and Ian have a wonderful discussion planned for you tonight. So, and you're here to hear them, not me. So I will hand it over finally to them. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Jen, so much. And I have to say, this talk was originally supposed to be just me all by my lonely only, but Ian was threatening to run away to Sweden. And I'm so glad that he didn't, because he's here to share the stage with me tonight and talk about these wonderful works that are in the Generations show. And, you know, we have a slightly different orientation on the show because, you know, Jen and I were able to we were literally practically at the airport with our rollerboards as the travel restrictions were dropped for Nova Scotia, so that we could go and look at these wonderful works in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, as soon as we possibly could. The whole idea for Generations kind of generated during the era of COVID, just before COVID started. So it was an extremely sort of high stakes, tight wire act to actually be able to pull this off within the time frame that we had. But we got to go and look at everything and eat lobsters and meet all the wonderful Sobeys and have a great time and look at all this great art and then come back to Toronto. From that point on, we were working with slides in models, and Ian was certainly seeing all of that. But what was great, Ian, was to see you walk into the galleries when the work actually all came in and was unpacked and uncrated, leaning on the wall, ready to be installed, and just seeing your feeling.
Astonishing. I'd been looking at little kind of postage stamped images, that was all I'd seen.
Yeah.
And no, just seeing the actual work was absolutely astonishing. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I had this slide up. I might as well speak to it for a minute. The whole idea of how to treat this exhibition came out of a desire to do honor to the way the Sobeys are, which is a very, obviously a very prosperous family, but also a very down-to-earth family. They have a great sense of humor. They're full of beans. Great ideas, a very playful bunch, super wonderful people to hang out with. And so, and obviously deeply passionate about the visual arts in Canada. So we wanted to make a show that really did not kind of plod through the periods of Canadian art and, bowing and scraping as we went. We really wanted to have a show that felt like they do. And so, this image that you see on the cover is really a kind of a clash between Cornelius Kriegoff and Kent Monkman, which you could see as kind of strange bedfellows. But for me, it was really this image that made me start thinking about how the show could be, in a way disruptive of the canon, which could render things rather dull, and rather be sort of playful and yield surprises. And once we started talking about that, then our wonderful exhibition designer Eric Pearson got in on the act with us, who's just in the background there behind Ian. I think he's hiding off camera. But, we all started together thinking, what if? And, the thing about private collectors is that, they don't have to observe the traditional way the story is told. They are free to do what they want with the work and discover their own connections within it. So we kind of took our cue both from the spirit of the family and from the spirit, of the collection, which is, very eclectic, particularly as the generations have gone down, and now the acquisition of contemporary Indigenous and other Canadian artists into the collection by the rising generation, or now the establishing themselves generation, Rob Sobey and his siblings in the family, and many of whom have been marvelous donors to this exhibition as well. So the show gathers from, several of the Sobey families, and it also, tells the story of three generations. And here's where all the fun and games began with Frank Sobey, one of the world's most successful high school dropouts, who realized that high school was a bore, but maybe business school would be more interesting. And it obviously was. And he figured out very early that the notion of the supermarket was coming, and he pivoted the family from butchering to general stores, grocery stores, and the rest is really history. The sort of Sobey empire starts with a little butcher shop in Pictou County, and it grows to what it is today with all these other ancillary brands, of course, that Empire Corporation owns. But here's Frank, and one of the things about Frank was, for a very hard-headed businessman, he had a real love of the visual arts. And he and his wife, Irene, who was apparently a real force to be reckoned with, an extremely bright and also very sensitive woman, and very canny with business. So it really was the Frank and Irene show. And they had a whole bunch of kids, and those children ended up being involved with the family business, primary among them Donald, who sadly died about 11 months ago, but not before escalating the family business enormously. And, now he leaves, he leaves the art part of his engagement with Canadian art, which he inherited from his father, Frank, largely to his son, Rob, but also to other members of the family who are all very proud and involved with, in addition to building the collection, to the Sobey Art Award, which many of us know about. And that began 20 years ago this year. And here we have a picture, it's the first thing you see when you come into the show. And this talk is a kind of a walk through the show, so you can get a sense of what you'll see when you come. But, this is the first work that you see. And it's for several reasons. One, because Brian was the first winner of the Sobey Art Award and was at that point, he was a known artist, but he was a dazzling newcomer that really was not yet a canonical figure in Canadian art by any means, as he has now become. He had just started making, 20 years ago, he just started making his masks. And this is one of the more recent iterations of this motif of cutting up the running shoes and making sculptures out of them, and dealing with issues of the Indigenous sacred and branding and mystique and so on, all of these things that he thinks about. But, he really burst on the scene with the Sobey Art Award. And I just wanted to take a moment before we start going through the rest of the show to talk about, we're going to see other artists who either were shortlisted or won the Sobey Art Award in this show. Brian Young in here, Mario Doucette, wonderful Acadian artist, Annie Pudugu, who died sadly a few years ago, Joseph Tisiga, Ursula Johnson, a fantastic Mi'kmaq artist whose enormous work fills the last gallery of the exhibition. But other artists that are not in this show, Nadia Mir, Kapwani Kawanga, Jeremy Shaw, Tim Lee, really when you look at, the lists of the Sobey Art Award over the past 20 years and you see who were the winners and who were the runners up, it's extraordinary to think of the kind of critical shot in the arm that those artists got just at the point when they needed it most. So, this work here stands for that at the beginning of the show, but it also stands for the idea of generations itself, not only the idea of the generations of the family, but also generating ideas and generating careers through the Sobey Art Award, but also, generating new connections in the making of this show. We've already found in making this show that exhibition ideas are being generated out of this. Like we became very interested in Quebec and Ontario art and their relationship to each other in the early 20th century. That is going to be leading to an exhibition. So there's all sorts of generations happening in this exhibition. But, one of the first things we want to look at is really when you walk into the first gallery is the generation of a connection between an artist like David Milne, who's one of the canonical, early 20th century artists, the contemporary of the Group of Seven, but a very different kettle of fish entirely, as we'll see in a minute. And Peter Doig, who is Scottish-born, trained in Canada, really nurtured within the context of Canadian art and deeply respectful of the legacies of Milne and the Group of Seven. Here he is riffing actually in this figure in a landscape painting, which is really kind of psychedelic in the feeling of it. He's riffing on a photograph that we have in our collection at the McMichael of Franklin Carmichael at Grace Lake in 1935. And it was most likely a picture taken by Lismer, I think. But it's that sense of solitude in the landscape. And we put these early in the show because, of course, the Group of Seven is very dear to us. At the McMichael, we have a spectacular core collection, all of which is on view now. So if you come to see Generations, don't miss that. But this idea of the single figure in the landscape and that absorption in the natural world, that was an idea that was very key to the Group of Seven. And obviously, the other wonderful thing I should just quickly mention is that the Sobey family collection is a family collection, and so is the McMichael. So we found it wonderful that we have this little photograph of Franklin Carmichael in our collection, but this is the very same image that has spawned this whole series of figure in a landscape paintings that Peter Doig made for many years at the beginning of his career.
I have to say, I do love the photograph. I think there are some wonderful images of Franklin Carmichael, but I particularly love this one because you can't actually see that that's who it is. And so it's really the artist in the landscape, and really what defines this as Franklin Carmichael is what he's drawing, because Grace Lake was one of his favorite places up in La Cloche, and he loved it for the very reason. You can see he's sitting on a piece of white quartzite there. He loved it because the hills sparkle. They're white. They're not Canadian shield stone. And so it reflected the light. Nobody ever really caught dazzling light quite like Franklin Carmichael. But I think what Peter Doig is looking at here is that wonderful pixie hood.
Yes.
I think it all boils down to the pixie hood. It's a fashion statement.
But it also, of course, gives you this totally mystical sense of the artist in the landscape. And no one could be more, totally at one and totally merged with the landscape than David Milne, who, again, was, of great interest to Peter Doig. And this is, kind of a canonical image by Milne, one of a whole series of works of this subject, looking over his painting place into the landscape. And Milne was just so singularly devoted to the natural world, to observing it. I mean, I was remembering the other night when I was on a night walk, I heard the wind in the trees, and I remembered reading in Milne's diaries about how he could tell what kind of tree it was by listening to it when the wind was in the trees behind him on a hill, and he would check himself and see if he got it right. So the sense of quiet and devoted, kind of connection to the landscape is very much Milne's thing.
I would also just say, I mean, the most amazing thing about Painting Place and the Palgrave paintings there is, and is still radical to this day, is the control of the color, because he's creating an arbitrary color system. For someone who was so embedded in the landscape, he doesn't waste his time just painting trees green because they're green. He invents a color scheme that does the job, but doesn't look like anybody else. It's the most perfect definition of the idea of painting as translation from what you're seeing into something on 2 dimensions. It's learned from Matisse, maybe, but nobody ever did it quite like Milne. And every time I look at Milne, I'm amazed by it.
I think, I put in one of these watercolors, but because they're so extraordinary, and they also have an almost hallucinatory quality to them that I'm sure Peter Doig would appreciate. But you're talking about Matisse. I mean, here's another example of what you're talking about in this gorgeous, gorgeous gray billboards picture that really, is not a painting of a white building.
No.
Those people don't have, hot pink faces, or, he's really, giving us a sense of an idea, a representation, a visual system that hangs together, but is not, strictly speaking, representational.
No,
and
it's about light.
Yeah.
Do you not think? I mean, it registers as sunlight, and yet that gray, I mean, it's the most unlikely color to try to register sunlight with that you could think of. But gray, not just for the building, but for the builder, but for the billboards and the costumes of the ladies in the foreground. He doesn't differentiate. He doesn't need to. I find he's a magician.
And so it's really, I look at this and I think of Matisse's Red Studio, and the way that you understand that studio is not all red. You just sort of suspend your conventional way of looking at color completely when Milne's, involved. And also, it's a delight to see a city painting by a Canadian artist. And it hasn't been, there is a great story to be told about cities in Canadian art. And that's a show that I hope will happen someday. But the other great city painter is actually an artist that most people don't think of as a city painter, and that's Lauren Harris. These beautiful paintings of the ward, which is kind of a working class immigrant neighborhood in Toronto, where the city hall now stands, which is all torn down. But, a very different kind of modernism than Milne's here.
But the color, again, I mean, the thing about Harris is what an astonishing colorist he is. And, he's very well trained. But I just love that patch of bright yellow and the bright orange chimneys. And the way he differentiates the tree, the house on the left from left of the tree, and the house on the right, which is done in green and blue. And it's all about light. But he does it with color. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, Ian, we have another Harris that's up in the gallery right now, that is of a brick house in Toronto with the light, the golden light in the upper reaches of the house. And I hadn't actually, noticed it, but what he's caught is, any of you who are in Toronto and looking for beauty, there's about 20 minutes at the end of every afternoon when there's gold held in the tops of the treetops and the chimneys and the rooftops in Toronto. And it's a perpetual interest of his, how something could be so chill and cold down below, and then just had this wonderful golden warmth. Even if there's no warmth in the air, there's warmth in the light, and it's great to see him doing that again here. I hadn't quite made that connection before.
And I'm also interested. Look at the way he's painted the tree by letting the ground show through, and that's something that all the group of seven learned from Tom Thomson.
Yeah. So these are bits of wood here.
Yeah.
You can see,
and it was a revelation to them. And Tom just did it out of sheer speed, and he spotted the result, and everybody learned from that.
Yeah.
So this is again evidence, which I've often seen, of the chit chat that went back and forth between the members of the group of seven and Tom Thomson. They were talking all the time and comparing notes. This is a lovely painting.
Oh, it is gorgeous. And so what's wonderful for me is having seen these works in different homes, to now be able to have them, as roommates. It's, and there's so much more than some of their parts too, when you get them all together. So the gallery that comes next is really about examining ideas of history and storytelling and place naming. And Nichols is an artist who he's born in Connecticut. He's a mining engineer and a watercolorist. He was an engraver too before he came to Canada, but in and around Nova Scotia, looking for gold deposits, and in his free time, making these very beautiful studies of the natural world in Nova Scotia, but they're tiny little things. They're not big. They're painstakingly detailed. But what he's picturing here is actually the first mining operations in the province. So it looks like a little homestead, but it's not. What he's looking at is the beginnings of resource extraction in this new to them territory. And there's a whole wall of these, which were donated by the Sobeys to the Archaeology of Nova Scotia, in which they kindly have lent to us. But we're putting those together. Here's another example, picture of the Chicago mill in Goldenville. But sorry, they share the gallery with other contemporary artists who are looking back to this kind of tradition of depicting a new environment, which was there was a whole raft of British watercolorists whose names we know, who did this as well in what is now Canada. But Mario Doucette, who's an Acadian artist, seems to look back on that tradition, I think, and make these really extraordinary pictures that kind of touch on the history of the Acadian people and their expulsion in the mid 18th century at the hands of the British and also the Americans who helped. So this is why Wonder Woman is appearing up above, is that she's representing the Americans who assisted with the expulsion of the Acadians, which was, of course, a very violent and definitive period of terror during the history of the Acadian people. Like other artists in the show, I'm thinking of Kent Monkman, who we'll get to in a moment, but really using humor, though, in the way that he presents these historical vignettes as a way to kind of draw people into the story and learn about it. And so here we have the ghosts of the departed. And these blurs here are representing, Mario tells me, the Acadian people whose stories we cannot know. So the people who have been erased. And so, we're drawn into these pictures with this sense of humor, but then when we get into it and understand them more deeply, we find, that these are very, in many ways, very tragic stories that he's actually grappling with. And this painting, has a slightly more buoyant quality to it. There was a pirate and Acadian hero called Joseph Beausoleil, Broussard, who used to make a menace of himself to the British. And here he is taking a pounding from the British warships, and another warship has been, sunk in behind and slipping into the North Atlantic. But in fact, Beausoleil Broussard took a whole group of Acadians down to Louisiana and established a new colony. So he's a huge hero to the Acadian people. And so, so Mario's really kind of giving us a kind of fractured fairy tales of Canadian history and showing another side than we're used to looking at. And in the same room, we have Joseph Tisiga, who is from the Yukon around Whitehorse, and makes these very large scale watercolors. So I must say I'm happy to have Tisiga's giant watercolors within eyesight of Milne's incredibly seductive and accomplished, beautiful watercolors that are in the adjacent gallery, because they're both really masters of the medium. And this is a particularly peculiar, Joseph Tisiga's watercolors are always kind of perplexing, but here this person, we take it to be perhaps a settler person, is confronting the threat of the Canadian wilderness as personified by a decapitated head of a grizzly bear. And in the background, I think that tree is kind of looks like it's sort of shimmying to life, and someone is indicating it as something else that needs to be dealt with here. But fabricated fear may only prolong the risk. Tisiga doesn't often help us with his titles. They're very atmospheric.
Yes, I was just kind of thinking it's basically he's looking at the wrong thing. It's kind of the bear can't hurt him, and it's a construction. It's a wooden construction, and he's face to face with it and facing off with this bear, and what's actually looming behind him is a very Scandinavian looking troll tree to me. Yeah. So it's like, he's face to face with the bear, and that's actually not the threat. And it's just, I find it an extraordinary piece of imagination.
It really is. And
there's that little person there frantically waving, like
over here.
It's funny, but disturbing.
Exactly. So we come out of this room, which has been about history, and we come into a rather grand space. And these two works, each of which we, in a previous incarnation of this talk, I had them each on a page by themselves because they're so powerful that they really need to be looked at one-on-one. But that's why you have to come up to the McMichael to see them. They're both enormous pictures. And one, of course, much earlier, Lauren Harris's Algoma Hill, which is just a revelation to us all at the McMichael, because as Ian has mentioned, it's normally reproduced and it looks kind of black. And
it's a famous image because it appears on book covers and everything, but and rightly so, but I had no idea. I just thought that this great purple hill behind was just incredibly dark. The reproductions I've seen give you no idea of the depth and variety of color in the painting. And I think, I love this juxtaposition just because it does show you, it does make a really quite interesting point, doesn't it? About brush strokes and color.
I think there's also, I think what was wonderful about having these two on walls facing each other is that the rest of the works in the room are abstract works by Bourgeois and Riopelle. And so there is this feeling in the room of a kind of Nordic color palette, and even a sense of a kind of muscularity about paint handling that Harris really seems to be stepping into here. So there's this kind of cascade of these blues and purples in Algoma Hill that are really in the foreground. The way the paint is laid on, it's extremely muscular, as if he's clawing his way into the landscape. It's very, very visceral. And I've always felt with Riopelle, and to a certain extent with Bourgeois as well, like they speak to the natural world. We know they're abstract paintings, but you feel like, they are speaking of bracken and sticks and rocks and slush and snow, to me anyway, but maybe I'm just, madly projecting, but I've always felt that at essence, the Riopelle's pictures are really landscape paintings.
And interestingly, of course, Harris is also clawing his way into abstraction. And yes, you're always aware of that. This is 1920, but, a dozen years later, and he's starting a career really as an abstract artist. And so I think the seeds of that are present in a big painting like this. Yeah. And when you see it next to the Riopelle, you realize that in some ways they're speaking the same language.
Yeah. Anyway, it is a fantastic experience to look at these two things in the same room. And also in that gallery, we have this fantastic coupling of these two earliest Bourgeois, right at the moment. I mean, the Revue Globale is published in 1948. This is the very moment when Bourgeois is taking the turn from some form of figuration. His work had been much more recognizably figurative before, but this is clearly some kind of plant form on the right and paysage or tree form, into Mes Pauvres Petits Soldats, which is really just a shimmer of light and color. So he's kind of, and of course, as so many of you will know, the Revue Globale was a manifesto that kind of like sought artists to lead the way to sort of cast off the shackles of heavy Catholic religious restriction, to have freedom in the body, freedom in the mind, sing the body electric if they'd only known about that, language for that. That would have been the automatistes as well. And, I think it's fascinating that Don, had both of these works, and that we can see the sort of ignition point turning here. And, a classic large period large scale Bourgeois painting, and they're hard to see because they don't travel a lot. These late Bourgeois are very thick; they crack quite easily. They're often in museums and held very, very dear to museums. So it's wonderful to be able to bring a work that really hasn't been seen. That's true of virtually all the works in this show. Hasn't been seen, outside of the family homes, or Crombie House, where a portion of the family holdings are shown in Stellarton. But, it's a rare and wonderful thing to see this Bourgeois made, I think, about 5 years before he died, in Paris, where he is, soon to be rendered destitute. He dies in Paris. Bourgeois has a spectacular show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam posthumously, and there's quite a fuss made about Bourgeois' passing in Europe, and then just a great silence. And I looked it up today, Ian, just to see when was that National Gallery show of Bourgeois, which was the last major Bourgeois show in English Canada. And again, you have to really see the National Gallery is actually kind of right on the border of Quebec and very much a bilingual institution. So that was in 1972.
Good heavens.
So there has not been in English Canada, a major exhibition of Bourgeois. And it just goes to show that these solitudes really persist deeply, and they're deeply entrenched in Canadian museum culture as well. And of course, it's something we want to be working really hard at the McMichael, and we have plans to do so. But, one of the things we realized in putting together this show is, even though those two solitudes are quite distinct now, 100 years ago, these artists were talking to each other. Jackson, who we think of as an Ontario painter, is born and trained in Montreal under William Brimner. He is receiving all the influx of information about French Impressionism in Montreal before coming to Toronto. So, we know, for example, that this Cesar Cote painting, would have been a very influential kind of thing for the group of 7 artists to see when a painting very, very like this from the same body of work was shown at the Ontario Society of Artists show the year that Moonlight was made by Tom Thompson. They were looking, this is, of course, Tom Thompson's Moonlight is 5 years before the formation of the group of 7. So, one of the things that's come out of this show, and thanks to John Gagan, who wrote a fantastic essay for the book, but, is this understanding of the more kind of communication between Quebec and Ontario artists that were happening at this time. And I think, you can still see them as very distinct stylistically, but, we think a lot about the group of 7 going to Buffalo and seeing the Scandinavians. And I think what's true is the group of 7 were also looking carefully at Quebec. And they said so. There's quotations from Harris, from Jackson saying, Cullen, Cesar Cote, Gagnon, they meant the world to us. They really opened doors that, that we didn't know could be opened. But the Scandinavian thing is there too. And that, Ian, that's an area of expertise for you.
Well, no, I'm looking at this Cesar Cote. It's a very sophisticated, effectively a European style painting. And it reminds me very much of Fritz Taulo, who's a Norwegian artist who based himself in Paris and trained in Paris. And so was you know, a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a kind of realist impressionist in many ways. And Cesar Cote is one of the finest painters in Canada. Just technically, I think it's absolutely astonishing. And this is a particularly beautiful one. But the other thing about Moonlight, I think, which of course, I stumbled on Moonlight, you know, so many years ago. This is kind of my initiation with the Sobey collection, because in putting together the Painter Canada show back in whenever it was, 2010 or something, I had a long phone call with David Silcock sitting beside me, talking to Don Sobey, because I wanted this painting for Painting Canada. And it couldn't travel. It was deemed, you know, it couldn't travel across the Atlantic. And so I reluctantly gave up. And Mr. Sobey was completely and totally charming, and obviously wanted to lend it, but really just couldn't. So I'm so pleased to see it here. The other thing to bear in mind is that one of the most influential paintings, I mean, you've mentioned Jackson, but Jackson was kind of lured to Toronto because of the impact his painting called The Edge of the Maplewood had on Thompson and Harris and MacDonald and Lismer, all of whom stood in front of it in awe. And at that point, effectively, Jackson was painting rather like Cesar Cote, hugely sophisticated, very European in his background. I mean, he changes later on, as we'll see. And the other thing to bear in mind, of course, is that Jackson shared a studio with Tom Thomson in early 1914 and was painting with him in Algonquin Park when war was declared later that year. And Jackson left for Montreal and ended up on the killing fields of Flanders and never saw Thomson again alive. So the link between them is, as John in his essay points out so well, is really very clear. And as I say again, the thing that I just wish I could be a fly on the wall. If you could go back in time, what I think you'd hear with all of these friends would just be endless chatter about what was happening in Europe, what was happening in Montreal, you know, what Jackson had seen in Italy, what he'd seen in England, what Harris had seen in Germany. These were hugely sophisticated artists, and they talked all the time.
All the time.
Oh.
So, I know this is a huge painting, which is installed at the end of a gallery. So you kind of, it takes your breath away as you turn the corner. And I think, you know, one of the other things that John touches on is just this again, a sense of a northern palette, and this kind of mauve color that you see in Cullen that then, you know, we find again, you know, when we look here at this very, you know, stark Harris northern landscape. But, you know, there's something of the awe of this, you know, the scale, the majesty, the quietude of this, that I think, you know, there's a kindredness in terms of the way they're experiencing color and light in the winter, and the way, of course, that the snow takes color. So in this room, there are works by the Group of Seven, and, you know, in concert with works by Quebec artists, and that's a very unusual chance to get opportunity to get a chance to see, because normally, of course, they're you know, put in different silos. So this is one of Ian's favorites. So I'm going to try and talk about this one, but, you know, it's swoon worthy.
It is. And what can I say? I mean, this thing is tiny. You know, it's the standard size of a sketch that we're so used to from Tom Thomson, and just so much information in there, done so fast. And I find this is the miracle of Tom Thomson, is that the technique and the color is so quickly applied. I mean, this thing probably only took him half an hour. And yet every choice he makes in terms of the brushstrokes, in terms of the choice of color and tone, tells you everything you need to know about this little view, including, and not least, the temperature. And I endlessly stare at Tom Thomson's sketches, and I'm kind of lost in awe, because this is something that he didn't learn in any academy.
No.
You can't say it's instinctive. He must have had, he had some basic training. But when instinct really took over in 1914, you then have these 3 years in which he is producing works of art that stand alongside anything in the Western canon, I think. And a little tiny painting like this,
Yeah.
I've never seen anything quite so brilliant in all my life. And you can tell, I mean, I'll be the one swooning in front of it if you come around the exhibition. I'm just going to be installed into this thing for
Well, I
weeks.
mean, one of the things, I was noticing the other day, we had a bit of a thaw before this brutal cold snap we're heading into now. And there were a lot of ice slush puddles.
Exactly.
And I kept looking at that green, that kind of phlegmatic green that the ice goes when it's starting to rot a bit and then refreeze. And I thought, he's nailed it. Like there's something so specific about his use of color.
It's astonishing.
It is. And the other lovely little sketch in this room is the Clarence Gagnon Bay Saint Paul, which is, I mean, these things I see flowing past me in the auction books every now and again, little Gagnon oil panels, and my God, are they miraculous. And this is a particularly beautiful one, I think, again, with that very abbreviated brushstroke, giving us the houses and the trees, but also, very, very particular, specific light over those dark hills at the end of the day.
He is a true master of light. And the best of Gagnon, and I've rarely seen anything that wasn't the best of Gagnon. They look as if they're shining. They do look, they look like they've got a light behind them. And that's just control of color and tone. It's just brilliant. I love it.
Amazing. Anyway, they make very good roommates.
They do.
So then we have a gallery, which is, one of the surprises in the show was really looking at how Lemieux in one generation and Maurice in another, we became aware that the color palette in these two artists was quite simpatico. Of course, they're both giants of Quebec art, but also that there's a kind of melancholia really that you find in the work of both art, a sense of tenderness, of remembrance. Lemieux definitely has the more austere vision, and Le Servant is a classic example of him, being his most stylized best. This sense of disconnection between these two figures, and of course he's very influenced by existential thought and so on. But the other end of the spectrum of Lemieux is really the series Time Remembered, which Don and Beth Sobey had installed in their dining room. So that was the first time I saw it. I came around the corner and almost dropped dead of shock. There was such a beautiful room, but each one taken from a snapshot that Lemieux's sister had made during their childhood vacations at Maison Manoir Montmorency up the St. Lawrence River from Quebec City. And, it's hard to get a sense of the beauty of these very swift and assured little works, but they're very poignant and tender. And I absolutely love them. They also look completely contemporary despite their gold frames. When you look at the paintings themselves, we've all been, saying that it reminds me of Luc Tuymans. I mean, they're very, they're very dreamlike as well in their sort of, you remember bits and pieces, but the image is incomplete and your mind has to kind of fill in the rest of it. So it's really an extraordinary, the Time Remembered series. It's really, late Lemieux is not always the best Lemieux, but what we see in this suite of late works is just an absolute masterpiece. I really do feel in this smaller scale. And I'm so glad that he did these, because it tells you a lot about how he was looking back on his life and who he was and, what he valued. They're gorgeous.
They're so romantic as well.
Yeah, they are. And then with them, we have a work like Golden Venice by Maurice. So it's Maurice and Lemieux together alone in this gallery. And this one, again, it has that lovely sort of mushroomy, soft color palette, dreamy color palette, but also the sense of a beautiful memory. And this is true of so many of Maurice's works. This is the Ferry de Saint-Malo from Dinard in Brittany in France. And of course, just quickly to say that Maurice was born in Montreal to a wealthy Scottish textile merchant family. His father was a very wealthy man and wanted his son to be a lawyer, but he manages to skip away to Paris and make a real reputation for himself in Parisian art circles. Ended up having an extraordinary life, sharing a studio in North Africa with Matisse, being a regular, judging the art exhibitions that were happening in Paris at the time, traveling extensively, both back to Quebec, but also to Cuba. And he was great friends with the Van Horn family through his father, who had railway concerns in Cuba. And, so he went there and made wonderful paintings in the tropics, and also, as you can see here, in France, Italy, and also in his native Quebec. But this picture, 1901, of the Ferry de Saint-Malo from Dinard, is a kind of trial run, I think, for one of his most famous works, which is a Canadian subject. So he makes this and he comes back. He ends up in Quebec City on a sketching trip during a trip home, and he paints the ferry at Lévis. Almost the same composition exactly, of the ferry boat coming in with its puff of smoke. Many of you will know it, coming into the dock at Quebec City, and you can see Lévis on the other side, kind of the eventual destination. But, really expertly concise paint handling here. Wonderful. I mean, those 3 red dots there make the whole painting. He is an incredibly sensitive colorist. And, also you were saying, Ian, earlier today we were talking, you were saying you found this an uncharacteristic painting by the artist. And you also mentioned you could feel the wind.
Yes, I always like that. Well, I mean, he is another of these artists like Gagnon, like Thompson, who is a true master of the tiny, these little pochades, those little, actually smaller than Thompson's usually. And he captures so much atmosphere. It's a really wonderful discipline, I think. And it's a real strength of Canadian art that so many of their artists did work on that scale, because they were so intent on going out and about into the landscape.
Yes.
And so they worked on a tiny scale and then, developed things back in the studio into a larger work. But it meant that they became expert at capturing particularly atmosphere and light in the sparest possible means. And I think that's what I'm seeing in this, because in subject matter, it looks like a kind of classic rural British painting in many ways. It looks very British, very agrarian. But the technique, it's all about air and wind and sky and light. And I think it's an extraordinary, deft and beautiful thing.
It is wonderful. And, Maurice was so important. As I mentioned, that show in 1911, it was Maurice that was in that show that they were all going down from Toronto to take a look at. It was a show of French painting with Maurice in it. And then there were other exhibitions that larger shows of Quebec art in Toronto as well. But, Maurice also had an enormous impact on the art, of course, of Quebec, because he would go back home to Montreal with all of his tales. And, one of the artists that he impacted on had an impact on was Mabel May, who of course was, this phenomenally interesting woman artist who was active in the Beaver Hall group. And it's worth remembering the Beaver Hall group, starts the same year as the Group of Seven. It is in some ways a kind of answering, in many ways an opposite, because a lot of artists in the Beaver Hall did figurative painting and portrait studies and things of that nature. We think about Lilias Torres Newton or Prudence Heward, but Prudence Heward and Mabel May both did landscapes. And in fact, I think Heward's landscapes have been underserved, and we may have to go back and take a look at them in an exhibition, because they're just marvelous shorthands. They're very blocky, kind of, I don't want to say muscular, because there's this kind of, masculinizing language about any painting that's good. That is sort of a virus I've caught from the Seven. But she's very definitive and bold in the way she makes her marks. And I see Mabel May, as a softer artist than someone like Heward in the landscape, but this wonderful sense of rhythm that we'll see also later on in Emily Carr's paintings when we look at them. And we've been puzzling, haven't we, Ian, over this title, The Sentinels, because there's a Harris painting called The Sentinels that we have, which is also two two sort of tree forms in front of a landscape that we have in our collection at the McMichael. And if there's any literary nerds out there, please help us, because we have this suspicion that this might be after some famous Canadian poem that we should know, or there should be, maybe there's some shared inspiration for both of these pictures, because they happen at around the same time.
Well, I do think, because of the sort of military implication of it, that there is a World War One issue there. So that missing Canadian poem, I think, will be on Flanders Fields. And one has to remember, we know this through David Milne's work as well, that one of the defining images that came out of the First World War was the appalling destruction of the land and those splintered trees that were destroyed by the shelling. And you cannot help but think that that's where this imagery comes from, because it was very well known, as we discovered when we did David Milne. He was buying postcards of the destruction. There was an industry, and so the imagery of the First World War, I think, made its way across the world in ways that perhaps you don't expect. And I think sentinels, it was an imagery that just came naturally.
I'll just flash forward to that Jackson. To that Jackson you're talking about. That would be another sort of battlefield type of image. This would be the kind of thing.
It looks like a shell hole. You're absolutely right.
It does. It's interesting, this Jackson, which is in the same room with the Mabel May. The Mabel is kind of hanging on all by herself. And in fact, she's one of only two historic women artists in this show. So she's got a lot of heavy lifting to do. The other being Emily Carr, who we'll see in a minute. But there's another war story actually in this painting, which I only put together afterwards, which was that Great Bear Lake is where the mining happened for uranium, which was required for the making of the atomic bomb. And Canada had this sort of under the radar, as it were, role in that, in the mining concerns that supported the extraction of uranium that was so essential to the American war effort at that point. And there was a geologist named Gilbert Labine who was friendly with the members of the Group of Seven. And so you'll find there's lots of Group of Seven paintings of Great Bear Lake and environs. And a marvelous one by Frank Johnson just went up for sale at Heffel in the last go round. That was spectacular. Huge picture of a kind of a snowscape with its little figures going across a frozen lake. Many pictures of Great Bear Lake, and that's why. It's because of another war, which, I think is sort of interesting here. But just going back to this Casson, because I know this sends you right over the edge, Ian.
Yes, it does.
They could not be more unlike this wonderful hot mess of a northern landscape. He's going for something else here. He's a very, very different kind of artist.
Yeah. I mean, he's been influenced. I mean, if you think back to that photo of Franklin Carmichael, of course, they were both friends. Casson and Carmichael were friends, but Carmichael was also, a kind of mentor to Casson. And so they went, they spent a lot of time together. They worked together, actually, at Sampson Matthews. And you see that Casson often gets kind of filed as a sort of footnote to Carmichael. And that is so not fair, because he develops a really powerful, almost mannerist landscape technique of his own, where he comes up with particular approach to form. And here, one of my favorite things about Casson is the way at this date, and right into the 1960s, in fact, he likes to paint trees like kind of shards of jade or like feathers.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of abstracting of one of the Group of Seven's most popular images, the whole idea of trees in the landscape. And he turns it into this elaborate kind of design. And one should always remember that Casson was a designer. He was, a commercial artist as well. And that is not to downplay him at all. He has a wonderful control over composition and color. I think. And
I
this
think
is
too,
a masterpiece, I think.
what I love of the Cassins in this period, and we have some in our own collection, is the way that he gets interested in the way that the light comes like beaming in. And, you know, part of the landscape is in the dark, and then there's this jolt of light where it hits these autumn colors. And of course, it's a phenomenon that one experiences out in nature in this part of Canada, in Ontario and Quebec.
But you can also tell, you know, that he's been sitting on top of a hill alongside Carmichael, because that's one of the great things that Carmichael adds in many ways, coming out of, you know, Lauren Harris's appreciation of the North Shore of Lake Superior, is the idea of sitting on top of a hill looking down at the panorama. And it becomes very powerful, and Casson is up for it as well. This is gorgeous.
All right, Sand Lake, Algoma.
Yeah.
We don't think Paris looking like this.
I kind of do at this moment. It's really interesting. Sand Lake, there was something in the water there. And there's just, you know, a couple of years, well, less. I mean, it's kind of 1921, basically, where he does several paintings of Sand Lake, and he uses this kind of tawny color. That particular yellow and that particular kind of sienna color, this sort of orangey brown. And this is uncharacteristic in many ways. And I've told this story countless times, that the outrage in England when Brian Sewell, who was the leading art critic on the Evening Standard, a terrible man, dreadful. Him and his dogs, I had to visit him once, and I was nearly eaten by poodles. Anyway,
have to make it to Canada.
Yeah, quite. You know, you have to escape. But he dismissed Lauren Harris famously as Disney-ish, and this caused, you know, practically, you know, riots in the streets of Toronto. I think the Canadians were absolutely outraged at this, but you can see why when you look at a painting like this, because it is very mannered, it's very abstracted, it has a cartoonish quality. And I think it's coming from the same place, interestingly, as Disney later on, and it's coming from Scandinavian, I think Scandinavian design. So I'm just fascinated by it, and I love the color. As I say, I think he's one of the great colorists. And for some reason, these symphonies of gold and burnt sienna and poisonous green just do it for me. Unlike Jackson, I have to say. You know, if I was to choose one painting that I think is important, this is a great Jackson of this period. But I don't like this particular style, because he's very varied, Jackson. He adopts different styles for different things.
He really does.
And this is where he's going really expressionist.
We have a couple of really wild ones at the McMichael collection. They're on view now too.
And the thing is, because he is such a sophisticated and knowledgeable artist, I think you can look to what he's thinking about. And I'm often reminded of Munch, that kind of, you know, the screaming landscape at the back of the screen, you know, the Oslo fjord painted in stripes of orange and red. And I think it's not putting it too far to say that he may well have been thinking along those lines.
I think so too.
But to me, there's a bit too much wriggling going on.
One doesn't want to overdo that sort of thing.
I know, but it's a great painting, but it wriggles a bit too much.
And then on the wall facing it, we have this fantastic symphony of blues, and these, you know, these dramatic skies with these dark, heavy clouds blowing over J.H. MacDonald, Lonely North. This is a very big picture. And it seems 10 times bigger when you're standing in front of it. You can really feel those clouds moving towards you. And again, this is MacDonald, you know, 7 years before the formation of the Group of Seven. So you can really see, I think, in these paintings that they're really still looking at Impressionism as an inspiration, and Europe and Quebec. And
weather. Do you know, I kind of think, because all the discussion at this period was about, you know, the whole of the teens of the century amongst these people was they were looking for the characteristics of Canada. They were trying to find a way of painting the landscape that did it justice and that was new. And I think it's quite, bearing in mind that, you know, Lismer, Varley, and indeed MacDonald all were English,
Yeah.
And as a Brit myself, coming to Canada, the thing that was overwhelming to me is the scale.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, horizons are horizons, but somehow yours are bigger. And the skies are enormous. And because you get such extreme weather, if you're standing in Georgian Bay and the west wind is howling across there, I think in 1912, 1913, artists were thinking, well, if we're going to paint Canada, it's extremes of weather that we're going to go for. And there's a period where Thompson and MacDonald are weather painters.
And it does seem like this is a particular area that, I mean, every collection has a, kind of personality. It does seem like heavy weather is something that Don and Beth were particularly attracted to as subjects in the art that they collected.
Were they trying to tell us something about Nova Scotia?
Nova Scotia.
I've never been, I don't know.
Well, you could open your front door on a winter morning and find the entire thing a solid block of snow with the impression of the doorknob, facing you on that actually happened to me once when I was living in Halifax. So yes, extreme. And, other extreme experiences of nature, of course, in the adjacent gallery of Emily Carr near Langford, BC, a fantastic large scale work by Carr in her late period where she's really moving. There's this incredible sense of rhythm in the landscape. She's left behind her, pictures of totem poles and villages, and she's just really having her own relationship with the natural world. And here, of course, we're seeing clear cutting, evidence of clear cutting in the foreground and this great surging sky above. And we put her, and this was the brilliance of our exhibition designer, Eric, we put her together with Lismer in a gallery of their own. And you can see, Lismer made this painting, Torbay, Newfoundland. He spent 10 years, I think, in the 40s, going to Cape Breton and around in the Maritimes on his summer holidays. And and that, became a really important period of time for him. He would have met Emily Carr when she came east in 1927 for the West Coast Art, Native and Modern. But I don't think that they particularly got to know each other in that period. But he seems to be onto something with the pictures that we have of Newfoundland and the Maritimes by Lismer, later in his career.
Yes, I think the link really was because Lismer in his career was traveled almost as much as Jackson. I mean, he was one of the most traveled of all of the group of seven. But interestingly, because of his work with education, particularly with teaching of children's art, where he was revolutionary, and he did revolutionize the teaching of art across Canada and indeed the world. I mean, he was
South Africa,
he was invited all over the world to talk about it. And so he went to BC, and I think he just, he made the effort to actually go and visit Emily Carr. And you couldn't go to BC, and spend time with Emily Carr and not kind of take in some of her feeling about the forests there. And so it's interesting to see these paintings like the Big Spruce.
Yeah, what I think is so interesting about it too is that, like, he starts spending, I think it's in the 50s that he starts spending his summers at Long Beach, Tofino, on the western coast of Vancouver Island, where you will find these monster trees. What I find interesting about it is that his tree kind of, in a way, is this solid, and he painted this kind of painting over and over again. There are many of them that Lismer made, one of which is in our collection at the McMichael. And another one, which belongs to Vera Frankel, the very senior and much beloved video artist, who was given that painting by Lismer when he was her teacher at the at school in Montreal. So
he used to do that. Yeah.
He gave it to her, and I said to Vera, do you think he gave it to you because she had announced that she was getting married at the age of 19, and he clearly disapproved. And I said to Vera, do you think he gave you that painting of the tree stump because he was trying to remind you of Emily Carr and saw you as a woman artist of substance that needed to take herself seriously? And she was like, anyway, so we had fun talking about that. But what Lismer is doing here is giving us a tree that really calls a halt to us. It is this monolithic thing that really bars our path. And what I feel in Carr's work is really all about movement a kind of a dance. It kind of invites us to move with it. And
I have to say, this car is absolutely awesome. It's one of the very best I've ever seen. And as you know, I mean, I love this 1930s car where she's, painting with gasoline, and it's just painting like a watercolorist, but with oils. And this is one of the most extraordinary I've seen, the sort of sense of light and movement and wind.
And light coming through. Yeah.
It's amazing. And almost like ghosts of trees. She hasn't, compared, as you say, with the Lismer, which is so solid. He's always very graphically solid. Lismer. He uses black outlines a lot. And I think he's coming from a slightly different tradition, which I also love. But my word, that's Emily Carr at her very best.
She can really move it around. And as you say, it radiates a sense of life, as only she really can do it.
Wonderful.
We shift gears then in the show, and we get to something, and now for something completely different. Cornelius Kriegoff, who is a great interest to Dawn and Beth in their collection, and they have a pretty vast collection of Kriegoffs, so we had to make some very tough decisions in order to hone the collection down. But really what we wanted to do was show, on the one hand, the habitant scenes of working class rural life in Nova Scotia, of which this is a classic example, which really, one must say, kind of gilds the lily a bit about what it must have been like to be a rural farmer in 19th century Quebec. I don't think it was quite as much fun as this looks like, but what his clientele wanted. Kriegoff, of course, came from Holland through the US into Quebec and established studios in Montreal and later in Quebec City, really selling these paintings, to a kind of rising bourgeois social strata in Quebec society that wanted these images of the happy rural, essentially peasantry as they would have seen them, and also of Indigenous subjects. So, what we'll find in Kriegoff is that he's often repeating a motif. We have one installation in the hang where you have the horse being groomed by a habitant farmer in a blue hat, and then in the painting above it, you see the horse with the habitant farmer in the blue hat in a different context altogether, as if he's just sort of moving elements around. But they're highly, highly skilled, and they are wonderfully various, even though elements repeat within them. This is one of his favorite themes too, which was, trying to create these highly romanticized depictions of Indigenous people in the landscape. Here, this seems to be, a bonfire with some kind of storytelling or discussion going on between people. We know he did have some contact with the Mohawk community near Montreal and was very interested in taking detailed renderings of clothing and other cultural belongings, but he would then mix them up however he wished, which, it seems to promise verisimilitude, but actually it's really a confectionery process that Kriegoff was in. And, again, very much going to these stereotypes about Indigenous people, kind of the wildness and of their way of life. You can see the canoe is pulled up and they're kind of gathering around a fire in this. This is an incredible painting when you see it in person. It's very hard to really appreciate it in a slide, but the effect of that silver moonlight is nothing short of miraculous. He is, in a way, Kriegoff always makes you smile, because there is a way you can say the word pot boiler in the context of these, but the pleasure they deliver is extraordinary. And the paint technique.
I'm going to interrupt you there because, and can we just go back one?
Yeah.
No, on one.
This one?
Moonlight one.
Moonlight.
Yes. Because what I'm seeing here, and this is what fascinates me. I mean, Kriegoff was born in Amsterdam, and he's Dutch Canadian, and studied in Germany. And that's exactly where you'd expect him to be. And what you're seeing here is a technique, a 19th century looking back to the 17th century. And that's where his language comes from ultimately. Yeah. And in this case, the most famous example, the most, I think, influential example is to Adam Elsheimer, who painted a tiny little wonderful painting that influenced Rubens and everybody in Rembrandt, of the flight into Egypt, but it was done by moonlight, and it has a fire and it has a lantern. In other words, there are three different sources of light. You have the moon, you have the reflection of the moon on the water, and you have the bonfire off to the side here. And so what I'm seeing here is Kriegoff really paying a kind of homage to the painters of 2 centuries before. And if you now move on to the next slide, here we have it again, and this is again a very 19th century thing. And you see it in Germany, and you see it in Holland, looking back to the 17th century. And interestingly enough, I'm delighted to be able to say, you see it in Scotland, where I'm from.
Here.
So David Wilkie made a career out of painting things in this manner. And what it comes from, ultimately, is an artist called Adrian van Ostade in the 17th century Holland, who was basing his genre painting on Flemish models by Adrian Brouwer and David Teniers. And the point about this, sorry about this long lecture, but basically the point I want to make is that we tend to forget that artists like Van Ostade and David Teniers in particular were giants of art at that time. The 19th century, these were the great names from the Dutch Golden Age. I mean, yeah, Rembrandt, okay. But Van Ostade and Teniers,
huge,
collected by kings. And that's why Kriegoff is painting like this. And what makes him special is he's painting Canadian scenes in this language. So this could be by David Wilkie until you look at the detail.
Yes.
And then it can only be Canada. And the same is true of his landscapes. They're David Teniers, but in Canada. And so there's nobody like him. He's completely unique.
And this kind of genre painting, Ian, is, you know, of course, has a long tradition in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
As well, these kind of morality tales or kind of amusing scenes from everyday life.
It's the same thing. It's going back to 17th century genre. I love this, though. I you know, partly because I'm a craft junkie, as you know, and you know, I kind of knit hats, and generally they're all unwearable, but I'm fascinated by the process. And here's a little essay on how to make a straw hat. I'm fascinated by it, and I want the hat.
Yes, it is a good look, isn't it?
It's gorgeous. Yes.
Yeah, and not to mention the carpet.
The carpet is interesting too, and probably
she's made.
Woven. Yes, everything will have been made.
So, and then there's a little, you know, sort of humorous anecdote in it of the little boy having the chair pulled out, you know, behind him. His minxy little sister is, you know, giving him a run for his money. And
Yes,
it's a bit of a shock. It's a bit of a shock, but I think, you know, perhaps also a bit of a shock for our visitors to find Kent Monkman's expelling the vices in the same gallery with Kriegoff. So they are the odd couple. But as you can see, this too is a genre painting, and exactly what Monkman is riffing on are these kind of moralizing pictures. And here, you know, we've had, you know, Kriegoff looking at Indigenous people as a settler person, but here the Indigenous artist in the person of Miss Chief, Kent's alter ego, is riding high and exacting her discipline on the settlers down below. And it's funny, we tried this painting in several spots in the room, and it wasn't until Eric had the idea to put it at the end of the gallery, the whole gallery kind of fell together, because in a strange way, you don't see it when you walk in, because the synchrony between all the colors in the room is so perfect that it kind of blends in, and then you sort of stumble over it, you know?
And it's perfect in the context of my, for which I apologize, my recent lecture on art history. Kent is doing the same thing. He's using the language of 200 years ago.
Yes.
150, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
To make an ironic and funny but serious point in art. So the language of the art becomes something that he exploits, and in a backward-looking way that
And then
Just brings
repurpose
you
it
up- exactly, brings you
in
up
a kind of
short.
progressive way. Yeah.
So they're both doing the same thing in different ways.
So
I
these
think
are these are really storytelling pictures. And the next gallery that we go into really takes this idea of storytelling further. And we have a number of artists that you wouldn't normally think of together in this gallery. And we'll just walk through some of them now. I'm just keeping my eye on the time a little bit, but marvelous paintings by William Kriegoff, who died in 1977, of Ukrainian heritage, grew up in Manitoba under the most difficult of circumstances, beset by poverty and unhappy childhood, onset of mental illness, like you name it, William Kriegoff suffered it. And strangely enough, the paintings where he recalls his childhood are almost uniformly, light-filled, radiant, rapturous winter days, or the pleasures of an Easter basket with the congregation meeting outside. Very complex arrangement, this picture. It's a big picture too. It's really extraordinary. Or this wonderful picture of a snow day. And surely they didn't have snowbanks this high in Manitoba, but maybe they did. That's a telephone pole. You see that young child in green outfit standing on top of there. So maybe they did, it's weather is a changing thing, as we know. And Kriegoff is just so good at finding the telling little detail in a narrative, like these little boys down here that are tunneling in, about to get themselves in all sorts of trouble, or this other figure that's scaling the heights, or the dog that's barking down here. There's always, when you look in Kriegoff, there's always these wonderful incrustation of little narrative moments. It's really a marvelous thing about him. And really, Donald, very much invested in this joyful, light-filled aspect of Kriegoff's production. What's actually really interesting is Ken Thompson, who's the other great collector of Kriegoff, really went in for the darker, more difficult and challenging works in the Kriegoff. So it's interesting what different people gravitate towards, and it's all part of the Kriegoff vision. Of course, it's all you have the dark and the light together. And then in this room also is the wonderful Annie Pudugu, who died under tragic circumstances some years ago, but not before creating a body of work that really redefined Inuit art in the 21st century. She made scenes of everyday life as opposed to traditional hunting or animals or mystical beings. She would paint, a family gathering around a freshly butchered seal on the kitchen floor, or a friend, over visiting with the parka half off, which is something you often see when people come into the house to have a quick visit. And very much a contemporary world outside. This is in a little house, and you can look out through the telephone poles and the prefab houses out beyond. Don actually kept two of Annie Pudugu's works on paper beside his desk. His office at Empire Corp was a really very low-key room with an old desk in it and some golf pictures and family photos and stuff. And that really, as I recall it, the only works I saw in his office were these two Annie Pudugu drawings. And I think he was probably, he was a sentimental sort. So I imagine he was probably remembering her, and he would have been very shocked and saddened by her death. But also that, these are such wonderful images of a way of life that's so unlike his own, and they're so unpretentious and down to earth. And he could have had any of these splendors in his office wall, but I think it's very revealing that he chose Annie's work there. And then the other artist in this room is Alex Colville, who's probably never been shown with William Kriegoff and Annie Pudugu, but it works out amazingly well. And it's, again, another scene of daily life, a kind of storytelling picture in which these two figures are kind of locked in this crosswise gaze, one of them with the rather menacing steamroller coming towards us, and then the standing figure in this kind of contrapposto pose, with beautifully rendered flesh and his blue jeans kind of slouching around his hips. It's all quite sexy, in fact. And this diagonal in the painting that just rivets the picture together formally. So it's just so often the case with Colville that composition and this very finely honed color values will just lock the parts of the painting together in a kind of a vice-like grip. You're looking out over the the landscape of the north side of Nova Scotia, looking towards the Bay of Fundy. It would have been near Wolfville, I believe, that this picture would have been made. But it's a stunner of a picture, and really looks great in that room with these other works. Let me just move on, just almost to the end of the sequence tonight with, Brenda Draney, Night Sky for Sandy. Again, if this is all about stasis and solidity and, owning the land and grooming the land, tending the land and claiming it, this is about a kind of fugitive energy. Brenda Draney is an Indigenous artist who lives in Edmonton. I think she grew up a great slave up in the north, and then came down with her family to Edmonton later in her life. We had a wonderful show with her a couple of years back that was sadly somewhat interrupted by COVID, but an amazing, early mid-career emerging Canadian talent. She has a wonderful show on right now at Catriona Jeffrey's Gallery in Vancouver of new pictures. And what is characteristic of her is this kind of unfinished look of the picture, this sense that a scene is evoked, but you can't quite read what's happening here. Is that orange thing part of the tent? Is it a landscape out behind? Is it flame? Is it fabric blowing in the wind? Is that blue vector there, so the interior of a tent? What's happening behind her haunches there in that black space? And is she, her facial expression is kind of inscrutable. Is this a person in some kind of extremity? I mean, I feel that that emergency orange kind of makes me feel like something is, like she's under duress, I feel. But, it's all very unspecified. And, as is always the case with Brenda, she just puts down what she needs to make the picture work and gives us all this space for the imagination to fill in. And then we move into the last gallery of the show, which is really devoted to the North Atlantic. And, one of the great contributions of the Sobey family of late has been empowering and enabling Kent Monkman to make his major mural projects for the Great Hall at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this is one of the two studies that you'll see in this show for those mega works. I mean, the works themselves, I don't know how big they were. They were like, 40 feet long, 25 feet high. Like, I can't quite remember. They were absolutely enormous. They filled the Great Hall and to enormous acclaim. And there was enormous funds raised in across Canada to support this. But the way that what really put it over the top and made it possible for Kent to devote the time that he needed to create these two works really was the patronage of the Sobey family. Kent has always been very close to the Sobeys, and they've helped him out at several key intervals in his career. And this was one of the greatest honors a Canadian artist has ever had, to be given the entire Grand Hall at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he made the absolute best of it. He made a superb duo of works. And this is the study for one of them, in which Miss Chief, here she is again, is lending a helping hand to what seem to be largely settler folks of various denominations and races coming to Turtle Island. And you see the Indigenous people on the foreshore. They're welcoming, but there's also some confusion in the interaction between them in the back part of the canvas. The white fellow with the blue pants on seems to be grappling somehow with the Indigenous woman that's there. There are people being pulled up onto the shore. So it's really alluding to the ways in which Indigenous people provided hospitality, I think, to settlers when they first arrived to what they thought of as the New World. Of course, it wasn't new to the people who'd been here for 5,000 years. But, Kent is very interested in this moment and makes these incredible maritime paintings. This one study for Miss Chief's Wet Dream. This is in the family's collection as well. And what you're seeing here is sort of old Europe in the form on the raft. Again, the quotation is to Jericho's Raft of Medusa. You're seeing old Europe in the form of, Queen Victoria, the Minotaur of ancient Greece, Marie Antoinette, the bubonic plague, perhaps, Vikings, the poodles of the court at Versailles, whatever it is we're looking at here. Jesus Christ is supine here. A French, a figure here, this French I take to be a French person who is leaning over, and the indigenous person here is leaning towards him with a peace pipe is what's in his hand, and he's being held onto by this brave here. And in this boat, this war canoe is a kind of whole gathering of indigenous people from all over what is now Canada. And you see these wonderfully painted sort of glassy waves. And what I found, when I went to visit Dawn and Beth's home was, this marvelous picture by John O'Brien, who is a very traditional marine painter, a picture of a bark plying its way through a stormy sea. And when you see these green glassy waves, this is exactly the kind of painting that's being quoted here in Monkman's work. Then the rest of the gallery includes other pictures of the North Atlantic, which has for centuries been a site of like exploration and endeavor and conflict. And we really see that in all the other paintings in this room as well. This fantastic Lismer of the warships was painted during Lismer's tenure as head of the Victoria College of Art, where he was a very influential and important teacher to so many, and just a spectacular sketch with a very alive sense of the sky and of the boat painted in dazzle ship decoration, which made them more difficult to torpedo, was the idea, or because it made it hard to tell which direction the ship was going, apparently, when you were at sea, and harder to fix on with a telescope. So that is a feature that a lot of both British and Canadian artists dwelt on, but few with the kind of dynamism of this wonderful little sketch. Also in this room, this beautiful MacDonald sketch of the shore with these lovely old sailing vessels that seem to speak of a century gone by more than the contemporary moment. This is 1923, after all. This is after the First World War. But, lovely, seductive movement in the foreshore and in the clouds, which are so solid and massed there. And then, overseeing it all, this, the ultimate lighthouse at Farrell Point, looking over all these other paintings in this room are storm tossed and full of action and full of conflict and incident. And, when you get to when you turn to see where you've come from in this gallery, you see this very serene, almost ominously serene figure of order keeping, which is this lighthouse. And I think it's a spectacular contrast that really, really works well in that room. And in the middle of this room, we kind of stretched ourselves a little bit, because, it's always, you always wonder how it's going to work out to incorporate an installation art piece in the middle of a room that's hung with such incredibly characterful and intense paintings. But in fact, Ursula Johnson's Museological Grand Hall is hugely at home in this room, and it's beautifully lit. And what you're seeing here, it's a suite of plinths upon which stand these beautiful incised plexiglass cubes that are very subtly carved with images of baskets made by her Mi'kmaq great-grandmother, Caroline Gould, who was a very noted and respected white ash strip weaver. She would make baskets out of strips of wood that were then treated in a particular way, and then she would make these extraordinary baskets with them. And there's a number of these in the space. I think there's 16 in all, if I'm remembering correctly. But from the baby basket to all sorts of baskets of other sorts of use. And you can see here how the baskets, you kind of look through them and experience them in relationship to these wonderful paintings by Kent and by Lismer and by MacDonald and the gang's all here in the North Atlantic. And that is how we chose to close the exhibition, with this kind of sense of the Maritimes, which of course is where the Sobey family is from and what is very dear to their heart. And it really feels like you can smell the salt in this gallery. I think it really, really worked well. And it's a very fitting, I think, tribute to this beautiful part of the world and to the family who have, done so much for Canadian art history, and also for the emerging artists of today who are so indebted to their vision and their commitment, really, to the ongoing story of Canadian art. So we're very, very honored to have this show with us at the McMichael. It has been an absolute joy to put together. My thanks again to the whole team at the McMichael and to Eric, who was so helpful in helping me figure out how to manage such an unruly approach to an exhibition, because it is far from canonical. as you can see from what we said tonight. But I think we'd be, delighted now to, I'm just going to back us up to there, sorry, to take questions from the audience and talk about some of the ideas we've talked about tonight. I don't know, Jen, if there's things out there that are needing looking into, and I'm afraid to look at the time.
Well, we've gone for 90 minutes now, and our viewers have stayed on the whole time, and there've been there's
good.
a bit of chatter in the Q&A and in the chat, and I think people have really enjoyed the ride. I know I have. There are a couple of questions that I think we have time for if we're brief. One was, Ian, you mentioned a critic that dismissed Harris as Disney-ish, but I didn't catch the name, and nor did someone else, and they asked, was it Laura Cummings?
No, definitely not. It was Brian
great.
Sewell. Brian Sewell.
Brian Sewell. Okay.
Sewell.
Yes. The
Moving
late.
along. Someone
late
asked,
Brian
so.
Sewell.
Another question that intrigued me was, if we had I'll paraphrase, but if we had more space than we have, what would we have included that is not in the show?
Well, we really have, we have about 20 works that we brought from the Maritimes that we were not able to fit into this iteration of the show. But as you mentioned earlier, Janet, it is going to travel across Canada, and everyone can work with the collection, as their institution, sees fit. But we really stripped the joint. Like it's not like we left a whole bunch. There's a lot of empty nails back in Stellarton right now. And, the family was so unbelievably generous with us that really we pretty much took everything. Yeah. And certainly everything that we wanted to. In some cases, we needed to make sure we were safeguarding the balance between different artists, although there's some artists, that are not as well known that get a larger representation here because they were functioning in a wonderful way in the hang. And there were many, considerations at play. But I think if you've seen this show, you've seen the Sobey family collections. Like, I think we really did take almost everything, but there was a case of which is the better, this one or this one. And we would talk about it and look at it again, and often with the family themselves. So, we are very happy with the checklist, and what's interesting about it is that when you go and look at it in the Maritimes and the homes, they're in people's houses. When you pull it together off the walls of those different domestic contexts and you look at it in a museum, it looks like a story of Canadian art. I mean, it looks like a museum in itself of Canadian art. So even more than I could have anticipated. So someone was making a lot of good decisions over the years, not just about groceries.
Well, this show, it comprises, I think it's over 175 works across 4 rooms. So it really is a feast, and it is best enjoyed. Although we've had a wonderful sort of appetizer with these slides, it is best enjoyed in person. So I hope that all of you who are in our audience today will get to see it, whether it's at McMichael or if you're joining us from elsewhere in Canada. I mentioned the different touring venues that this exhibition will reach. So I hope you will all go to our website, book tickets to see the show, and while you're with us, buy the book that is due to arrive on March the 5th. If you want to get on our list to pre-order the book, there's a link in the chat that you can click to be contacted when the book arrives in stock. And I'll just take this moment to say thank you deeply to our panelists, Sarah and Ian. The time just flew by. I think we were all hanging on every word. I know I was, and I'm looking forward to taking another spin in the show tomorrow. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you, Ian and
Sarah.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.